Welcome to this week's Practice What You Teach. Michelle, I am so happy to have you on with us this week to talk about this topic that I know you're going to talk about because I feel like it's one that we all experience at some point, but we don't really know how to deal with it. So I'm really curious as to like what some of the tools are that you use and what you feel like really works. But before we get into that, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here to talk about this. I'm very passionate about grief and loss and how to get through it. So thank you for that. So I'm Michelle Davis and I'm a licensed clinical social worker and I run a private practice, Inner Window Counseling. My focus areas in my practice are grief and loss, also adults with ADHD, and also people who are looking to heal from codependency or people pleasing. So I have kind of a mix of people that I work with, but grief and loss is a special passion of mine.
Yeah.
And so in my practice, I use a combination of CBT and solution focused therapy, as well as mindfulness. I'm a brain spotting practitioner, so I use brain spotting with my clients. And my general view on therapy is that it's the most effective when you're addressing both the mind and the body. And that's especially true for grief because grief really does take a toll on our body. And a lot of times we don't think about that part of it. But you also need, practical tools that you can use in between sessions. And so that's a real focus area of mine. I work with my clients so that we're processing in session, but after the session, you have things that you can take and actually use in your life.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, grief is it's one of those very it's so complicated and heavy and hard and even if logically you know what to do, sometimes it you can just kind of feel so lost in it sometimes. So I I'm definitely curious to get into what some of that looks like, but before we do, I'm more curious like how did you kind of find this work with grief? Like how did you kind of find that it's even though it's really hard, it's something that you really enjoy working with.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so I've had my own personal experiences with grief and loss. My father actually passed away when I was 14, and so that was my first big experience with deep grief. And at the time, at 14, you just feel like such an outsider among your peers, when you lose a parent. And at that time, the funeral home had sent me some bereavement literature, and I would get that every couple of months. And that was actually really helpful because it was very normalizing to me to read that. But it wasn't really until years later that I got the opportunity to start working with those who are bereaved. I spent 2 years as a bereavement counselor at a hospice agency.
Mm.
And it was really meaningful to me. Anytime that I would mention to somebody that I was a bereavement counselor, you kind of get the like, oh, that's so hard. That's so tough. And it was, and it definitely was. And also I found that there was an enormous amount of hope working with those who were going through loss because, with time, with effort, with intervention, with support is probably the main thing. We can learn to carry our grief. We
Yeah.
don't get over it. It never goes away, but we can learn how to carry it and we can learn how to keep that person as part of our lives and keep them special to us. And so grief work really means a lot to me because I, as much sadness and heaviness as there can be, in my opinion, there's also a lot of hope.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it sometimes can take time to find that feeling of hope, but it can be there, right? And certainly, through a lot of the things that you mentioned, and support really is one of those big ones. Like it's possible to get there, even though, gosh, in those moments when we first start feeling it, we're not sure that we'll ever get there.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, in the beginning, it's you're just lost in a fog and you don't
Yeah.
really know which way is up or down. And it is impossible, I think, in the beginning to see, kind of the end of the path. But walking with people on that journey and really being with them in those hard moments and some of the hardest moments that anybody can experience,
Mhm.
it's a real honor for me to be able to, you really get down in the pits of it, and there isn't anything that anybody can really say or do to take that feeling away, but it's more about companioning with that person and just being there with them in their pain.
Yeah.
And with time, they do learn to rebuild, and they do learn to find those reasons to have joy in their life again. And so
Mhm.
it is possible.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that word, kind of, being the companion, because you're right. There's not the right thing to say. And I think that the pressure to figure out what the right thing to say is exists on both sides, right? Because as the person receiving the support or the comfort, like, we're never going to hear the right thing. But also on the other side, there's a reason that you feel like you don't know what to say because there's not necessarily the right thing to say. Um, and so, yeah, that idea of maybe just kind of showing up as a companion, kind of being there and sitting with the person, right? That,
Mhm.
yeah, can do a lot. So with, certainly your experience, your training, all of the things that you've learned, what is the strategy, the tool, the technique, the thing that you kind of help people with as they're working through their grief that you also use yourself when you have experiences that grief comes up?
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah. So one of the most healing tools that I have found, or kind of ways of thinking about grief and loss, is something called continuing bonds. And that is a theory that replaces our older way of looking at grief and loss prior to the continuing bonds theory. When coming on the scene, there was a lot of idea of the goal of grief was to get to this place where you could, sever that relationship with the deceased so that you can build a new relationship with, the living.
Mhm.
And continuing bonds really flips that on its head, because now we know that finding a way to create a new relationship with the person or the animal that you have lost is the best way to heal and go forward. So continuing bonds is just this theory that death doesn't end our relationship. It changes it radically. Obviously, it redefines it, but it's not the end of the relationship. And so I think that that is something that does provide that hope, because it takes away some of the pain of the finality of it. And so I've used continuing bonds in my life, and I work from that model when I'm working with someone who's grieving.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly something that makes sense to me, right? Certainly, that relationship can continue to exist just in a much different way.
Mhm.
What does, while it makes sense, I'm also just kind of wondering, like, just in practice, like maybe like what does it look like to kind of turn this concept or this kind of theory into, like, how do you use that? Like, what does it look like?
Yes, absolutely. So it looks a lot like different ways that you engage with that person's memory or that person's spirit, their presence, and that can fit into all types of you know belief patterns. It's not necessarily dependent on a particular way that you're viewing what happens to the spirit, after death, or whether or not there's an afterlife. It can fit into all forms of belief, but it's really engaging with that memory in a very tangible way and in a very intentional way. And so some of the interventions that I use with my clients involve memorialization, journaling, letter writing, speaking out loud to that person, and not feeling like that makes you, like, oh, you're off your rocker. No, that's completely normal. Telling their stories to other people and really saying their name, and not feeling like you have to kind of put that away or not think about them, not talk about them. Rituals. and incorporating aspects of their lives or their memory into existing traditions and celebrations that you have.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and it seems like there is quite a bit of flexibility with this, right? So different, you know, the ebb and flow of grief, right? And kind of some days it just feels a lot heavier than others, and it's not kind of this like very like straight line of kind of like, oh, the intensity goes down and down and down every day, right? It is very much up and down, looping around all over the place. And so it seems like the variety in what that looks like also kind of gives opportunity for, depending on where you are with that grief on that day, you can kind of tune in with it in different ways. It's not like oh, this has to look like this every time.
Correct. Yes, absolutely. And you're so right about the trajectory of grief. I talk to my clients about, we would really love it if progress was linear and just this nice straight line from A to B. But I talk with my clients about, it comes and goes in waves, but in terms of your progress, you should think of it like loops. And so you're looping up, so you're going up, but there's going to be times when you're back around and it feels like you're back where you started from, and then that's normal and you're really not, but it's a spiral.
Yeah. Yeah. And certainly different things can kind of bring that up, right? Sometimes it can be maybe a little bit predictable, like maybe an anniversary or a time of year, or maybe another loss related to that loss. But sometimes it can also feel out of the blue and confusing and kind of like, why am I here today? Why is my brain kind of going there today? Um, and so, yeah, just really having some variety in terms of what it looks like to maybe kind of tap into and kind of honor that memory, whether it's talking about it, telling other
Mhm.
people about it, or maybe just kind of like holding space for yourself. What are maybe some of those methods that you feel like have worked really well for you or really resonate with you?
Yeah. So I'll give some examples of ways that I've used this in my life. One of the examples I mentioned, my father passed when I was 14. And because I was so young when he died, there's a lot of years and a lot of things that I've experienced that unfortunately he didn't get to do with me, didn't get to participate in. And so, when I got married, for example, we had the candle at the altar that my husband and I, we both lit. We took our lit candles and kind of lit the candle that represented my father. That was a way of kind of bringing him into the ceremony, bringing him into the tradition, and on an everyday, well, not an everyday basis, but an annual basis, I guess you would say. One of the things that he and I really shared. We both have a love of horror movies and kind of fantasy movies, and so every year around Halloween, when I'm decorating my house, I love to buy decorations for my house around Halloween, and I'll put up a decoration that's new, and I will say out loud, like, "Man, Dad, you would love this. Like, you would think this was so cool." And so I still take time to really intentionally reflect on how things that I enjoy and traits that I have come from him and link me to him. And so bringing him into those traditions or those important moments in my life, that's one example.
Yeah. And that's a really great example because it also seems like it's something that, it's certainly a way of kind of honoring that person, honoring their memory, honoring like your own grief experience, but it seems like in a way that feels comfortable for you.
Mm,
And that feels natural. It's not something, it certainly doesn't sound like it's something that's kind of forced, like, oh gosh, I have to do this thing. Um, and it also sounds like it's something that, while connected to some flavors of grief, maybe still kind of taps into like some positive, kind of like heartwarming kind of feelings too.
yeah. And I think that that's definitely a product of the fact that, my dad has been passed away for 20 years now. And I still think about him. And, when Father's Day comes, there's many years that I'm able to focus on the other men in my life that, have that role. But about one Father's Day, maybe about 3 years ago, just randomly, I was very sad and I cried on that Father's Day. And, that had been 17 years since my dad passed. And so it just really shows we learn how to adapt and we learn how to live around grief, but those feelings never completely go away. And that's normal. That's completely normal. So if there are people in your life who are, pressuring you or maybe kind of thinking, well, it's been 2, 3 years, why are you still upset about this? That's normal. It is normal that it just sometimes comes from, like you said, you don't know where.
Yeah. And there's no timeline, right? A timeline doesn't exist in terms of how long you're allowed to kind of, be in that grief because it's different for different people. And even within the same person, it can be different for different losses. And, I think too, sometimes there can be, a little bbit of like, oh, well, maybe I'm grieving the loss of a pet rather than loss of a person. So I'm not allowed to grieve that long. Like I just need to move on now. Or maybe kind of feeling that pressure from others. And we grieve pets in a very similar way that we grieve people. So there's still a timeline does not exist. There's no deadline for how long you're allowed to have.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, and there's certain types of grief that we think of as what we call disenfranchised grief, which basically means that society unfortunately does not recognize the depth of our feelings for that particular grief, or there's something that we feel gets in the way of us being able to express that grief to others without feeling some measure of being judged or being shamed. And pet losses can be one of those losses because, people will compare it to other losses that they have had, maybe the loss of a person. And every grief is different. Every grief journey is different. And so it really shouldn't be a question of better or worse. It's just different. And it's just gonna look differently for you than it is for somebody else. And with that, example of pet loss, in June of 2021, I lost my dog. Her name was Lily. She was my soul dog. She was like I've had other dogs, and she's just the one that really like got me. And she just always seemed to know my mood and how to cheer me up. And it was really hard. It was really hard to lose her. And so one of the things that I did with this continuing bonds theory in action was I bought a special bookshelf to put in a room of my house, and I used part of that bookshelf to make kind of a memorial area to her. And so I have her urn. I have like a little clay paw print that they took her paw and kind of pressed it into some clay on the day that she passed, and they gave me a little bit of her fur and put it in a little container. And I also have some pictures of her. I made like a special photo book out of some of her pictures. And so anytime that I'm really missing her, I go there. I go to that room of my house and I spend some time, I open up the little container that has her fur in it and I'll smell it. And it makes me feel close to her to be around the objects that remind me of her and her photos. And so it's a place for me to talk to her, to cry, to look at her pictures, and really just to feel close to her spirit. And that's what continuing bonds is all about. It's about ways that you can still feel close to this person or this animal companion, whoever it is that you've lost, but to be able to keep that conversation going with their spirit.
Yeah. Yeah. And it seems like there can be value in whatever way it looks like, maybe having something that is a little bit more tangible, something like a specific place, having maybe items from the person, the pet,
Mhm.
whatever.
Mhm.
Or if that's not possible, even just kind of having photos or maybe things that remind you of them, even if they didn't belong to them. Um,
Yes.
but it seems like there can be something of value in having something to either like actually look at with your eyes or kind of touch with your hands, but something to like interact with in a little bit more of a tangible way rather than just kind of like thoughts in our mind.
Yes, that's 100% correct. And it kind of reminds me too, it doesn't necessarily have to be static either. I had one client whose mother loved flamingos. Flamingos were like her favorite animal. And after she passed, my client, when she would go out and about for, first bit after her mother passed, she kept seeing flamingos everywhere. She would see them on bumper stickers. She would see them on, advertisements, all these places. And, my client really interpreted that. And I completely understand and support. These were signs from her mother. This was her mother saying to her, I'm still with you. I'm okay. And I'm still with you. And so kind of opening your heart or opening your mind to the idea that your loved one can still be communicating with you in different ways. That's another way to kind of take some of the pain of that finality out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's something that, even I know there's ways that I can kind of relate to that with some of, the losses that I've experienced and just kind of those ways that we kind of feel like that person is, with us or communicating or just trying to let them know or let us know that, they're there, with things that we might see. Or maybe just kind of run into. So yeah, yeah. So if people want to learn a little bit more about some of these techniques in terms of like coping with grief, if they want to maybe just kind of learn more about what are some other ways that maybe this kind of shifting of the relationship can look like, maybe ways of kind of holding on to some of those memories, whether it's creating a space in their home or something different, like what are maybe some resources that people can use to learn more about this?
Yeah, I have some resources that I can share, and hopefully you'll be able to kind of pass them on to the listeners. So I have a document that I share with folks it's like 50 ways to memorialize someone. And it
Yeah.
has some really creative ideas on there of ways that you can use that memorialization in your life. And then also, whatsyourgrief.com has a really good article on practical ways that you can practice continuing bonds. That can pass along that article. And whatyourgrief.com is a really great website as well for just kind of general grief information, knowledge, support.
Yeah, we'll definitely put some links to those down in the video description so people can find them. And if anyone wants to connect with you, maybe to get in touch with you to learn more about grief or maybe to do some work, how can
Mhm.
they find you?
Yeah, so you can go to my website, which is www.innerwindowcounseling.com, or you can also email me at info@innerwindowcounseling.com. And I would love to talk with anyone that needs it. If you're looking to do some counseling, I can probably help out with that. But even if you just need information, get in touch with me. I'd be happy to do what I can to help.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing. I think this is it's one of those topics that at some point we're all going to go through, we're all going to experience. It's one of those ones we just never feel prepared for. And so it's nice to kind of have some resources, maybe kind of have some things kind of tucked away for, when we might need them. So thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your knowledge and also kind of just sharing what's worked for you. Thanks for tuning in today. If you liked this video, subscribe so you can find out when more episodes are coming out. Check out Michelle's links in the video description below to learn about grief and how to find her. And thank you.
Thank you.